Hey gang, today I wanted to take you through my process for a heavy metal minimalist style Imperial fist. I'll make more for other legions, chapters and factions, and cover theory like lighting and composition as well, all on this channel. Step 1. Base coats. For the yellow areas, I'm using Wicked Pink from the Army Painter. If you prefer Warhammer brand paint, then Pink Horror is close enough. Maybe. I don't actually own that paint, but you're looking for a kind of screamer pink but less dark, if that makes sense. Yellow can be complicated, as it is a tricky paint to use. They're always too translucent and hard to blend. Imperial fists have a more golden yellow. It's warmer compared to something like Lamenter's. So using a darkish pink undertone will help guide the yellow on top to being more warm without being too dark and making coverage with the yellow even harder. Using the pink here will also help with the reds by adding some clashing contrast to it. I think Imperial fists have a more orange-toned red, which goes well with the warm yellow panels. Normally, I would say to not put pink reds and orange reds on the same mini, as it can look like you used the wrong paint by accident, but in cases like this, you can use this slight difference to make the orange-red appear more yellow-toned, so we don't have to go so hard on the highlights. So for this undercoat, you want to try and use a colour here that will give a bit of colour to the Nuln Oil wash we will do over the top. You could use a dark yellow like a murky green or brown, but I find these colours can make the yellow look more drab or green over the top, which would be good for something like a Lamenter, which have more of a cold yellow to them. There should be a Lamenter video coming up if you wanted to see the difference that this makes. This base layer doesn't need to be perfect, but try and make the coverage uniform. This will help in step 3, as patchy base coats may show through the top coat later. If you wanted to be pedantic, then you can do the Nuln Oil in just the places you want it to stay, but I find just a full dunk helps with in-depth coverage for deeper shadows and speed. For the trim, I'm not using metallics as I only have reds, golds and coppers, and I didn't want to introduce mixing paints too much to these tutorials to keep them super simple and easy. So for these red areas, I'm using the Army Painter's Wyvern Fury, but something like Warhammer's Wazdakka Red would work as well. You could also skip this entirely and just do the whole thing with the pink undercoat. It won't make much difference and will only be noticeable really on the sides and undersides of the pauldrons. And it can be a weird feeling using such a saturated pink where you want to put yellow, but this is very much trust the process. Step 2. Nuln Oil. This bit does not need to be careful, just slop it on. Puddle it in the edges and recesses for darker shadows and try and do entire panels in as few strokes as you can, otherwise you may get tide lines as it dries. Make sure to properly shake your Nuln Oil for a minute, as I've had a couple times I didn't and it's dried glossy because I didn't mix in the pigment well enough with the medium fluid. While this dries, make a cup of tea and think about how your Primarch is only missing and not dead unlike someone else. Like this video, subscribe, and potentially become a channel member to get exclusive channels in my Discord where I post photos of my kitten and take requests for tutorials to make. I also stream painting on here and Twitch if you want to hang out and ask questions or watch me be bad at Space Marine 2. Step 3. Top coats. For the yellow areas, I'm using Demonic Yellow by the Army Painter. Warhammer Flash Gitz Yellow is a decent alternative, although I find it to be a bit thinner and harder to get the coverage that I need. You want to pick a nice saturated colour for this layer, as it will be the majority of the finished mini, as it is only highlights after this. On pieces like the pauldron with trim, these are called inside corners for the yellow. I leave about a millimeter or maybe half a millimeter gap between my top coat yellow and the corner crease, so I can have a dark outline to separate the yellow from the trim a bit and to save me from accidentally going up the wall to the trim. For the base coats, I didn't water down my paint beyond making it easy to slap on. For these top coats, I did add a little bit more so I could move it easier on the mini to create the shape I wanted before going back over with a thicker coat to concrete it in. For this yellow, be careful of it getting too dry in your palette, as the medium can get kind of sticky and not spread so well, and it's more obvious with medium heavy light pigment colours like yellow. If you do a couple of thin layers, leaving the coverage kind of patchy and uneven, this can look more battle-worn, and you can use those brushstroke lines and patchiness to help plan out any weathering or battle damage that you want to add. I don't really do battle damage, and this isn't a tutorial for that, so I'm just gonna kind of do it thick and keeping it uniform and kind of flat looking. I just prefer it looking super new and clean. Be most careful in recessed armor, such as on this underarm, under his elbow and wrist plate, to not get the yellow on the perpendicular sides of the extruded surfaces. I'm still trying to keep that 1mm, 0.5mm border on the inside corners, but don't worry too much where the gap gets too thin as long as those perpendicular sides stay clean and dark. For the red top coat, I'm using the Army Painter Pure Red, but Warhammer Evil Sun Scarlet is a good alternate. This trim only has outside corners. This means the panel reaches a cliff rather than a wall, so if you use the side of your brush along the top, you shouldn't get overflow down the cliff sides. Try and keep the sides of the trim the dark shaded colour. It's hard to fix this if you spill over, as it is that base colour plus the Nuln Oil. I recommend to pick plain to be on the top, and then keep perpendicular sides dark over the whole mini. If you find some more places that are more visible and are distractingly pink, then you can make those bits yellow too. Unlike the other minis in this tutorial set, I have done this myself on the final one at the end, making the tilted forward, technically in shadow neck collar yellow instead of leaving it pink, for example. Step 4. Highlights. On the yellow, I'm using Ice Yellow by the Army Painter. Warhammer brand Dawn Yellow is probably your closest match otherwise. Here, I'm essentially outlining all my top coat yellow with outside edges, or like on this elbow panel, and sculpted edges in the middle of an entirely top coated section. Because we're doing these over the top coat, if you make a mess, we can go back over this later with more top coat color. I will add though that unlike the other tutorials, I'd recommend not making too much of a mess, as 50% of the yellow comes from putting enough to color the panel yellow and then 50% from the pink base underneath. So adding more yellow to fix highlight messes can lead to those patches being more true yellow than our warm yellow we have achieved so far. Again, try and not slip onto the dark areas, as it will be harder to fix, especially here with the pink. So go all over and edge up all those edges. I tend to water down my paint a bit for this just so I can use a smaller brush so the paint doesn't dry before I put it on the mini. If you find the edges to look too pale, mix in some of the top coat colour until you find a shade you're happy with. Adding more top coat will lead to more subtle edges, which can be nice if you then use the unmixed highlight paint to do some dot highlights on the corners of the edge highlights. To clean up these highlights, as they are only on the top coat, you can carefully straighten up wonky highlight lines and make the highlight lines thinner to fix any mistakes you made. This is probably the bit that took the longest, as I wanted to be careful to not have to go back and fix them and cause patchiness I mentioned earlier. Since it is a mini, you probably won't notice this unless you're 5 centimeters away from your paint job, so don't worry too much, I'm just a little obsessive sometimes. If you're doing an entire army like this, then I probably wouldn't recommend sub-assembling, but it does help. If you're going into a fully built and glued mini, you only really need to do step 3 onwards on parts you can easily reach with a brush. This will by accident make a nice shadow area behind the guns and under the arms that will make him look a little more dramatic and lit. However, with the pink, it might be a bit much in terms of how much pink is left showing. With sub-assembly, you can get every surface to look flat and uniform with lighting, so ending up with a more cartoony or classic heavy metal result. The only difference this will have to actual heavy metal styling is that I don't do the highlight lines on the plate surfaces of the shoulders and the knees. This is just personal preference, I don't like how it looks, so I just don't do it. On the red, I'm using Lava Orange from Army Painter. If you're using Warhammer paint, then Fire Dragon Bright is your equivalent, but I find this paint to be super thin and it can be difficult to work with in comparison. For the trim, I tend to treat them as metallic, so I pick outer edges or corners to highlight, and then a secondary bright spot if I feel like the vibe is right for it. I did add some of the pure red to my Lava Orange just so it was a little closer to the red than the yellow, so it is a bit more subtle, but feel free to make yours more contrasty. Try and feather out these highlight spots so you don't get harsh tide lines which can look wrong. The rest of the owl. From this video, learn the things and put it to use on the rest of the mini. This style is good for quick, consistent minis that look good with only a handful of paints. In total, this arm took me about 15-20 minutes, not including the Nuln Oil drying tea break. When I painted the rest of the mini afterwards, it took about the same time as the single arm, maybe a little longer, as it's a very simple process meant to be fast to do. So this is my fully finished Imperial Fist in Furnace Marine in this style with all his markings free-handed on. You can use transfers, I'm just lazy and I don't have a sheet for him to use. If you do use transfers, remember to use a matte varnish over the top to get rid of that shininess. I also gave him a nice red stripe on his helmet to mark him as a lieutenant, which I thought looked quite nice. Here's a list of all of the things I've used in this video. Again, I will make more videos for the lenses, various guns, and freehanding hacks, so don't panic if yours doesn't look exactly like mine. I don't tend to use transfers, but I can also cover these in a video as well if needed. As always, thanks for watching. Check out my other hobby content or my dumbass gaming content on the main channel. Like, sub, leave a comment how you got on, Discord in the description, and see ya!